Good morning, everybody. And thank you for joining us today. Every dollar that the federal government allows to be lost to fraud, waste, and abuse is a dollar stolen from American patients and from the American taxpayer. And that's money that should be going to legitimate health. President Trump directed us to end this corruption after President Biden and my predecessor, Xavier Becerra, allowed it to flourish. Our job is not just to catch the bad guys, our job is to stop the fraud before it happens. Today I have two major announcements. The first, CMS is pausing more than $1 billion in federal Medicaid payments to California and to Minnesota because of suspected fraud and non-compliance. That includes more than $867 million for California and over $200 million for Minnesota. If those states want that money, they need to provide documentation that these payments are legitimate. We use traditional financial verification, we used AI, advanced analytics, and other cutting-edge tools to identify suspicious activity and potential fraud. In Minnesota, the funding involves 14 high-risk areas that Minnesota's own legislative auditor has identified as especially vulnerable to fraud. In California, we suspect much of the questionable spending involves in-home services. And second, I'm pleased to announce that another significant step forward in the Trump administration's battle to end fraud. Under my authority as HHS Secretary, we are expanding the exclusion authority. Now both CMS and the Office of Inspector General will be able to use that authority to remove bad actors from federal health care programs and in many cases to permanently ban them from returning. Unlike Medicare, the states control most of Medicaid's funding, and they provide the guardrails. We provide the funding. The states are responsible for how they spend it. And by law, they must document how they spend federal dollars. And we have reason to believe that taxpayer money is being misused, especially through fraud. We have a duty to stop the payments, demand answers, and then follow the evidence wherever it leads. If Governor Gavin Newsom or Governor Tim Walz wants this funding released, all they have to do is provide basic documentation showing that these services are legitimate and not fraudulent. And that's common sense. But the Biden administration abandoned that kind of oversight. Instead of protecting your money, they opened the floodgates to theft. They dismantled basic program integrity and oversight. When Xavier Becerra came into this office, there were only 80 individuals involved in the program integrity program. By the time that I got in, there were only 6. 74 of those were gone. That's 6 individuals responsible for ensuring program integrity and guarding against fraud in 50 states and 5 territories. Even when they suspected fraud, the Biden HHS sent checks anyway and tried to claw back the money later. It didn't make sense and it didn't work. The scammers got paid, the taxpayers got stuck with these enormous bills. Under President Trump, HHS is restoring common sense. We are not sending Medicaid and Medicare dollars out the door until we have confidence that they are being spent lawfully and appropriately. CMS is working alongside the White House Task Force and our fearless leader, J.D. Vance. Together, we've already identified and stopped $42 million in Medicare fraud. That is more than the GDP of 72% of the nations in the world. That's how much fraud, waste, and abuse the Trump administration has uncovered and stopped in just one federal agency. If left unchecked, that kind of fraud threatens these programs and the people who rely on them, the most vulnerable populations in our country. President Trump wants to protect Medicaid and Medicare, and we are doing that by remaining strong and guarding against the fraud, waste, and abuse that jeopardizes those programs and the Americans who rely on them. As FTC Chairman Andrew Ferguson, who helped lead the White House task force, put it, our benefit programs and our whole society were designed for high-trust people. The Biden administration nearly broke that high-trust society. They looked the other way while fraud, waste, and abuse exploded, and they incentivized fraud, waste, and abuse in all 50 states. They held no one accountable. They violated the social contract that makes this country strong and that makes our democracy function. To restore that trust, we have to enforce the law. We have to end the fraud, waste, and abuse. And this administration will do whatever it takes to keep your taxpayers' dollars out of the hands of criminals and fraudsters. If your state wants Medicaid funding, it must meet basic documentation requirements. If we suspect fraud, you will not receive taxpayer dollars until you prove that those payments are legitimate. That's how we make America healthy again. That's how we restore the integrity of our democracy. And that's how we make America great again. And thank you. And now I want to introduce my friend and colleague, CMS Administrator Mehmet Oz.
As a physician, I'll tell you that if you stand for long periods of time, you'll get varicose veins more likely. So there are a few seats here, many of them back who are standing. I'm gratified by the large number of individuals that came. We do have seats if you wish to sit. Secretary Kennedy, thank you for allowing us to crush fraud. It's one of the OKRs that Kim Brandt will speak later, designed early in this administration to make sure that we would tackle these challenges. I also thank the Secretary for delegating exclusion authority to CMS. We will use it judiciously, learning from Mark Spell and other allies who have already been afforded that ability, that delegation. I also want to thank the President, which we're speaking about today. The people behind me are that all-of-government approach. They use all levers of government to be able to make sure we protect those on Medicare and Medicaid programs. We're making massive headway, as Secretary Kennedy outlined. We're protecting American taxpayers, American patients, and the outrage, the anger that America feels crosses party lines on this issue. It's very, very difficult for anyone to think it makes sense to throw money away, especially since we think there are foreign multinational organizations involved in some of this weaponized fraud. In coordination with HHS, obviously, OIG, the DOJ, the White House Fraud Task Force, most importantly, in this case, the states, we have the ability to prevent $100 billion going out the door. The number that Secretary Kennedy outlined, that the CPI group has already stopped to $42 billion, is a stunningly high number, but it shows the amount of success we've had. Let me introduce some people behind me. You heard his quote earlier, runs the White House Anti-Fraud Task Force. Scott Brady on that team as well. Judson Leader Lewis, White House Task Force, also joining us, and will speak later. Mark Spell from OIG, Dan Brillman, Rory Howe, Kim Brandt, Janine Ilugo, and Steve Farina are all parts of the CPI entity that has been so effective in cleaning up the mess that we inherited a year and a half ago. Today, we are calling on two states, because this is a partnership. We need states involved, but there are two states in particular today that we have concerns about, California and Minnesota. We want them to come alongside us, federal partners, to ensure that Medicaid dollars go to the services that are required by real people with real problems getting real care. All those have to fit together. We have uncovered, unfortunately, already in the last 18 months, billions of dollars that have been stolen from the American people, taxpayers, and from patients who often have lost their health, their lives in these scandals. And those have only been used, those funds, to pad the pockets of criminals. No mas, no more. It stops. Every quarter for years, CMS has asked states to show us the receipts for their expenditures. In this administration, we took it to another level. We asked them to focus on targeted high-risk services, services that are often provided by your family, often provided by unlicensed individuals in unsupervised settings, doing things that we couldn't tell if they were actually happening. Those services, because they're high-risk, demand that we're more thoughtful, more insightful about how we audit them and decide that they're legitimate or not. These are the areas where the data tells us that there is fraud and waste And they're likely to occur. They do occur, and we're identifying it with unfortunate ease in the system. When there are signature and significant outliers, patterns that we've identified, anomalies that seem to happen again and again and again, federal law mandates, requires us to pause that funding so that the states fix the problems. That is the story behind today's announcements. In Minnesota and California, our reviews are going back to just over the last few years, turned up the same recurring theme again and again, every single quarter, claims in these same high-risk categories that the states have not yet been able to document fully and acceptably to the federal government, claims that are unresolved, and claims that smell like fraud. And if it smells like fraud, we're not paying for it anymore. Today, we are deferring over $1 billion in federal Medicaid dollars, $1 billion to Minnesota and California until they can substantiate their claims from this past quarter of audits. Here's the breakdown for each state. I want to give you the details. You may have questions on it later on, but I want you to have all the data in one spot. In Minnesota, we're talking about 14 high-risk programs, high-risk service categories like personal care and home-based services. Again, often these are services that your family would typically have provided for you, that the federal government has started to fund, but unfortunately it can be abused. Roughly $413 million in claims were under review this quarter. That was the total in Minnesota. Of that, $3 million, a little over that, is tied to specific documentation gaps. As an example of a documentation gap is charging us for care you provided to a deceased person. We're not going to pay for health care for dead people. And over $3 million in Minnesota. You'll see the numbers in California in a second. $1 billion for Medicare, or whether Medicaid beneficiaries or providers who are deceased, is a red flag to us that you're not doing your homework well. Another portion, over $42 million, comes from claims tied to nearly 870 providers that we flagged through fraud detection analytics. We identify people has been of a character that historically defrauded the government. We don't trust them, and when we see bills from them, we scrutinize them more aggressively. However, the largest part of today's deferral comes from something that's new this quarter, and something worth paying attention to. Minnesota, all 50 states, but Minnesota in particular, was asked to audit all the people providing services in these high-risk areas. And Minnesota itself disenrolled roughly 3,000 providers. 3,000 providers who historically could send bills willy-nilly and be fine. They themselves have disenrolled them for failed background checks, failed site visits, and other issues. This raises questions about the claims tied to these same providers in the quarter before they were removed. Again, Minnesota removed the providers. We look back to see how much they billed us last quarter, and unfortunately, it was a lot. It's a big part, it's the majority of the $199 million that we're deferring from Minnesota today. Now let's go to California. This is the focus in California. It's called In-Home Supportive Services, IHHS. Again, going to someone's home, providing them care that oftentimes their families would have offered. This provides care for seniors and for people with disabilities so they can remain safely in their own homes. Done correctly, these programs could make sense. Over the past 2 federal fiscal years, California's spending in this program, this is a critical statistic, comparing state to state. California's spending in these in-home programs went up 24%. The rest of the country's average is about 12%. So California increased spending at twice the rate of the average of the rest of the entire nation. That doesn't make sense. That gap accounts for about $391 million of today's deferral. Another $250 million, $250 million, comes from claims tied to high-risk providers, as I explained earlier, those who are billing more than a year after the service is provided, those billing for 4 or more patients all at the same time. Hard to juggle that many patients. And if they rank the top 2.5% of all billers, we were worried about them. This is a very conservative approach, by the way. We could have taken a lot more money. But this, we believe, is a very thoughtful, judicious way of moving forward. The final comes to about $5 million, by the way, when you also add some of the other red flag issues. And particularly the $5 million covers bills that were paid after a beneficiary's date of death. It's a bad look, again, when you're billing the federal government for dead people's health care, not as needed after they pass. Or during a hospital stay when they weren't possibly at home to get the care you're claiming you gave them, or if they're outside the eligibility barriers. This total audit adds up to $646 million directly tied to our review of the in-home services. But there's another big part here that California has still not rectified. As part of our standard quarterly oversight, including a focused review of claims involving individuals with unsatisfactory immigration status. unsatisfactory immigration status means you can prove that they're supposed to be in America and that they're eligible for these services. Because this is an ongoing massive problem for California, we're also deferring an additional $221 million this quarter. Dan Brillman will speak more specifically about these. But altogether, $867 million deferred from California today. Added together, it's over $1 billion. California and Minnesota, the states and CMS have a stake in getting this right, protecting our most vulnerable. That's why, as a whole of government approach, it takes vigilance on both sides. We are committed to supporting this program, to cleaning up the fraud in healthcare. We need states to be true partners, coming up and working with us to fix these problems, to protect the American people. Someone speaks to this more powerfully than anyone I know. Dan Brillman, who built a very large business outside of government, gave it all up to come into government, is in charge of CMCS, which is Medicaid and CHIP and other services. And he's done a lot of the heavy lifting to work through this deferral process together with Rory and Stephen, who are standing over here to my left. Dan Brillman.
Thank you, Dr. Oz. Secretary Kennedy, let me start with something that's incredibly important. First, everything we do begins with data. This is data-driven analysis. These are anomalies, these are outliers, these are red flags that go way beyond the norm. Dr. Oz just talked about a few of them. And the team behind me at CMS works so hard that every dollar is spent correctly. Second, today's action doesn't change benefits or eligibility. This is a deferral. It's a pause to review past receipts when we identify something that's inconsistent with how Medicaid operates. We ask questions. We want to make sure every dollar is spent correctly. And a deferral is exactly that. It's a pause that gives states the opportunity to demonstrate that every federal dollar claimed goes to what it's supposed to go to. So what does the state need to do to make sure they recover this? First, as Secretary talked about, they need to produce complete documentation supporting the claims that were submitted. Second, they need to validate that the beneficiaries were eligible, that providers were qualified to bill for Medicaid, services were actually delivered, claims complied with federal and state requirements. And third, most importantly, this team behind here of experts from the task force as well, when states identify problems, they need to take action. They need to go after improper payments, they need to terminate and suspend providers, they need to strengthen program integrity controls, and they need to refer suspected criminal conduct to law enforcement. Now, if the documentation supports the claims, federal funds move forward. If it does not, taxpayers should not be paying for these services or these claims. And this is exactly how the stewardship of taxpayer dollars is supposed to work. Our objective is to make sure that every Medicaid dollar reaches those who need it. Here's why this matters. I just want to take a step back. Every governor, every legislature in the states, every Medicaid director faces choices. Every dollar lost to fraud is a dollar that cannot pay for a child with complex medical needs, an adult with intellectual disabilities, or a veteran, like that I serve with, are waiting to receive services at home. So let me make it real for you. Right now, there are hundreds of thousands of Medicaid beneficiaries waiting on what we call home and community-based services wait lists. These are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, medically fragile children, people with physical disabilities, including veterans I served with in the Air Force that rely on Medicaid now, waiting months or years on wait lists. If states can clean this up, reinvest those dollars, we can reduce or even eliminate these wait lists immediately, entirely cleared out. Every person could get services so much faster. That's why we care so much about this. As someone who serves and continues to serve in the Air Force, this is personal to me and personal to a lot of people behind me that you're going to hear from. I served alongside men and women who rely on Medicaid today. They deserve to know that every dollar that we spend goes towards them and not fraudsters, waste, and abuse. I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Andrew Ferguson, now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I'm from the President's Task Force on Fraud. The Vice President, when the President put him in charge, articulated a two-pronged approach to fighting fraud in the federal government. The first, as Secretary Kennedy and Dr. Oz discussed, is we have to switch from the process of letting money flood out the door from the federal government into the world and then chasing it and hope we can get some of it back. It doesn't work. It's not how you have to fight fraud. The way you stop fraud is you prevent the money from walking out the door. We've heard a lot about what CMS has done just in the last couple weeks to make sure that every single dollar is accounted for, that the money that American people have turned over to the federal government that they earned their money that they turned over to the federal government in an act of generosity to help their fellow citizens is actually going to help their fellow citizens. The second prong that we talk about is making sure that people who commit fraud go to jail. Just last week, or just a couple weeks ago, on that front, the Department of Justice announced the arrest or indictment of more than 400 fraudsters who had committed more than $5 billion in Medicaid and Medicare fraud against the people of the United States. The results on the enforcement front have been massive. Just 2 months ago, Director Kash Patel at the FBI, at the instruction of the Vice President, created the top 10 fraudsters most wanted list. And just since its creation, we have extradited 3 of the top 10 from foreign countries, from Turkey, from Somalia, from the Philippines. Just put that in context. 4 years ago, the FBI under the previous administration was arresting grandmothers for praying rosaries outside of abortion clinics. And today, the FBI is chasing fraudsters who have bilked billions of dollars from American citizens to every corner of the world and bringing them back here to face justice at the hands of the people that they have hurt. So on the enforcement front, the work of the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, soon to be Attorney General Todd Blanche, has been phenomenal, and it will continue. We've heard a lot about what we've done on the anti-fraud front by keeping money here at the HHS. I just want to talk about some of the work that the other agencies have been doing simultaneously. The Department of Education, not a place you would probably think a lot of fraud is happening. Billions of dollars of loans are paid out to fraudsters who sign up for loans and for college degrees just to get the money and run. Just since the task force was formed, they've blocked more than $250 million from walking out the door, and estimate that their anti-fraud efforts that Secretary McMahon picked up from nothing. There was no anti-fraud work being done at the Education Department under the Biden administration. And just since the Secretary McMahon's tenure, they're estimated to save more than $2 billion efforts this year alone. At HUD, the Secretary Turner, again, picking up an agency that had no meaningful anti-fraud work going, stopped money from going to the Los Angeles Housing Authority, which was being used not to fund work on homelessness in California, but was being used to fund left-wing NGOs. They are now cut off from receiving any more federal funds. And just yesterday, HUD announced that the Virgin Islands Housing Authority, which has received hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild the islands after hurricanes, and was not using that money to rebuild the islands after hurricanes, has also been suspended from receiving federal funds on the same ground, that the money is not being used for the purposes that American citizens are turning it over to these governments to use. Similarly, at the Small Business Administration, Secretary Loeffler's team has identified more than $123 billion in fraudulent SBA loans just this year alone, and is on track to stop nearly $1.5 billion and claw it back in this year. And the Department of Labor, our unemployment insurance program, is critically important for Americans who are experiencing hard times, has uncovered $5.3 billion in fraud. And thanks to the work of Acting Secretary Sonderling and Inspector General Disposito, is working hard every day to recover those funds and get them back into the hands of the American taxpayers from whom they were taken. We've heard a lot about big numbers today, and they're really important, but I want to pick up on something that Mr. Brillman just talked about, which is more important than just the numbers. This fraud doesn't just hurt all taxpayers. It does. CMS alone pays out $2 trillion of money that American citizens turn over to HHS to help their families and friends and neighbors in need. That's more than the GDP of almost every other country on the planet that HHS pays out every year alone. But this isn't just about money taken from our pockets. This money, like Mr. Brillman was explaining, that should be going to people who actually need it, go to enrich the worst people in our society. When we were in Minnesota just a couple months ago, we were explaining to the press that an anti-homelessness program in Minnesota that was designed to protect many veterans from homelessness was shut down because it was so inundated with fraud, Minnesota couldn't even afford to keep it going. And we're going to hear later this morning about skin substitutes. We talked about those a couple weeks ago. But these aren't just this isn't just money that HHS was paying out to fraudsters. These were procedures being performed on people, surgeries being performed on people who didn't need it so that doctors could pocket the money. Stopping the fraud doesn't just protect the fisc. It protects real people from real injury, and it makes sure that American citizens who are entitled to this money, that all of us have given our money up to help, actually get the money. And the second issue that Secretary Kennedy just talked about that is so important for this anti-fraud effort is restoring social trust. All of these benefit programs are not designed to make sure, naturally, that every single dollar is going where it intended. When these programs were set up, they were set up on the assumption that everyone who participates in these programs, federal bureaucrats, state bureaucrats, and people who are going to apply for the programs are going to play by the rules and that we can trust everyone to do it. And what we have learned is that that's just not true. Our society has disintegrated from the high trust society that it has been, and the only way that we can restore that high trust is to make sure that the money stays in the agencies or goes to people who actually need it. And if you get money fraudulently, you go to jail. And that is what this anti-fraud effort is about. Not just protecting the fisc, it is restoring in America. It is making America great by making sure that the social trust that a self-governing democracy to survive can be restored. That is why this effort is so important. And to talk a little bit more about the specifics, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Jetson Leder-Luis. He's the chief economist for the task force. So many of the great things that the agencies have been able to accomplish, they accomplished by working with Jetson, who's one of the country's leading academic experts on government fraud. Jetson.
Thank you, Chairman Ferguson. I appreciate that. My name is Jetson Leder-Luis, and I'm the Chief Economist and Deputy Executive Director of the White House Anti-Fraud Task Force. I just want to give a shout out and big thanks to Vice President Vance, without whom we could not be doing any of the things today. When fraudsters steal from federal programs, they are stealing from the American families that need those benefits to survive, and I take that personally. When I was a young child, my family was homeless. I lived in a homeless shelter with my sister and my mom, and we received food stamps to keep going. Eventually, my mom was able to find work and move us back into an apartment. And when later in life she got sick, she received Medicaid benefits that were able to keep her in her home and out of a nursing home. And that's what these programs are designed for. These federal benefit programs are for the American families who need on hard times, like my family, and not to line the pockets of criminals. And so I'm thrilled to announce some great success on this front as well. Back in April, we launched a new approach to Medicaid fraud called the Medicaid Fraud War Room. And this is a combination of effort from CMS, from HHS, from the states, and from the task force. And I'm glad to say that in the first 90 days of the Medicaid Fraud War Room, we have we've surpassed over $200 million in prevention. That's real savings for the Medicaid program. And we're doing this using machine learning. That's a form of AI that allows us to analyze the Medicaid claims and then turn off the tap and stop providers from receiving fraudulent funds. This is in contrast, as Secretary Kennedy talked about, to the old model of pay and chase. We are stopping the money before it ever goes out the door. And importantly, this is a scalable way of fighting fraud. We can do this in every federal program. We are doing this in every federal program. And I'm proud to say that we are currently tackling dozens of new Medicaid fraud cases per week using data. And that's ultimately what our task force is about. Our task force is about taking an all-of-government approach and leveraging the very best modern tools in order to protect the federal programs for families that need them. And so I'm thrilled to to introduce my dear colleague Kim Brandt, who will give even more details about Medicare fraud.
Thank you, Jackson. What Dan mentioned earlier, $1 billion in Medicaid dollars deferred because the documentation doesn't add up, is what happens when you catch fraud on the back end. It matters, but I want to tell you about what happens when you stop it on the front end, because that is where CMS has been focused and we are seeing huge results. Last year, CMS stopped $41.9 billion in Medicare programs, allowing us to bring back that money to the trust fund, which is a 59% increase over the previous year and the highest return on investment ever recorded at CMS. That's money that will help to extend the life of the trust fund to provide benefits for everyone. 68% of those savings came from cost avoidance, stopping payments before they went out the door, not chasing them afterwards. On the Medicaid side, we recorded $4.1 billion in savings last year. That's a 165% increase from the year before. And that momentum has carried into this year. In just the first quarter, CMS has revoked 1,413 providers and suppliers. That's a 40% surge from previous years and the largest quarterly increase on record. We've imposed over $187 million in payment suspensions just in the first quarter. We've also identified $850 million in overpayments through medical review. Again, over $1 billion that we have been able to come back to the trust fund to put it so that we can help provide services to people rather than paying fraudsters. Our Medicare War Room has now stopped over $2.1 billion from being paid. And as you just heard, the Medicaid War Room is just beginning to post equally impressive results with over $200 million stopped in just 88 days. Our partnership with the Vice President's Task Force and the HHS OIG is allowing us to stop fraud at unprecedented levels, which will only continue to grow. But now let me give you one concrete example of what prevent and detect looks like in practice. Let's talk about skin substitutes. For years, manufacturers set their own prices and Medicare and Medicaid paid whatever they asked. Spending exploded. This year, we moved to a fixed payment, a set rate per square centimeter, so the government, not the manufacturer, sets the price. 6 months in, the numbers tell the story. Year-to-date spending on skin substitutes this year is 95% lower than it was in the last year. We are now spending in line with 2019 and 2020 levels before the runaway pricing began. The billions and billions of dollars that were flowing out the door every year, we stopped that. And that matters because much of this was for fraudulent payments. For example, one 80-year-old woman who had been allegedly receiving over 5,000 skin substitutes. Now, I don't know about you, but if you think about that, that means she would have been mummified if that would have actually happened. So we also are helping it because at the end of life, a lot of people take hospice, and many of these skin substitute payments were for people receiving these during the end of life, which was unnecessary and in many cases harmful to the patient when it actually occurred. So for years, skin substitutes were one of the biggest drivers of growth in Part B drug spending. As you'll see on this next chart, you can see that the trend building quarter after quarter all the way through 2025. In 2026, it massively reverses. Skin substitutes are no longer driving spending higher, they're bringing it down. Meanwhile, spending on other Part B drugs has remained relatively steady, showing that this policy targeted the problem without disrupting the rest of the program. What's important about this is that our beneficiaries are still getting the care they deserve. People are not being billed unnecessarily for skin substitutes they don't receive or getting them when they don't need them. This is not about rationing care for us, it's about paying a fair price for these services. And that's what it means to be ahead of fraud, not chasing it. Today's deferrals are part of the same story. $1 billion paused because the data raised serious questions and federal law requires answers before we can allow the money to flow. The bottom line is we're saving billions, we are protecting beneficiaries, and we are just getting started. And I'll now turn it over to the Inspector General, March Bell.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'm very proud of the work that the Office of Inspector General and CMS do together, especially this 90-day and running partnership in the Medicaid Fraud War Room. And I'm also just pleased to be part of the Vice President's Task Force. The leadership of that task force is on the podium here. Don't want to forget about that. It's like a declaration of independence on the stranglehold that fraud has had on our programs, our tax dollars, and our beneficiaries. Now, without the leadership of Secretary Kennedy, Dr. Oz, Kim Brandt, Andrew Ferguson, and others, we would not be where we are today. By the way, I used to get an hour a week with Jetson. He's one of the smartest people I ever met. He would come by and ask questions, make observations, and what an asset he has been to this whole effort. Now, the OIG core mission has always been waste, fraud, and abuse. We have investigators, auditors, evaluators, data analysts, and a legal team who are on the front lines of fighting Medicare, Medicaid fraud, and other fraud as well. I want to just say something first about the legal team. Last year, our legal team did 2,600 exclusions. These are people whose conduct or behavior has led them to be excluded from all HHS programs for a period of years and in some cases life. You've heard about some of the cases that lead to exclusion, but I'm very thankful for the innovative idea, the creative idea by the Secretary to also delegate that authority to CMS. This is going to be a force multiplier. It's going to create additional momentum, and it's going to exclude additional bad actors. Now, let me introduce you to the men and women. Just walk through the hallways of the OIG office for a minute. The investigators who do the cases, there are over 400 of them spread around the country. $15 returned to the fisc for every dollar they spend. For every dollar to fund them, they return $15 usually to the Medicare, Medicaid trust funds. A great ROI. In June, they led the investigation with HHS, 8 other parts of HHS, the FBI and others, 455 defendants, 5.6 billion patients were at risk, exploited trust, taxpayers' money siphoned. The return on the enforcement action has great monetary impact, but I never really thought about it this way until Dr. Oz mentioned it, that if we cut all the fraud out of the healthcare system, it extends the Medicare, Medicaid trust funds out years into the future. What a gift that is for the taxpayers, for Congress, who doesn't have to find more money, and for the recipients of that money. There's another fact about fraud I like. If you believe what the GAO said a few years ago, 1 in 5 of you in this room will work all year or was working all year to pay taxes that were stolen. That's the ratio. That's how high GAO believes it is. That's the past numbers, and we are all up here to say no more. That's the past. That will not happen in the future. People were standing by and not doing their job. And by the way, who steals from the poor in this country? What kind of people steal from the poor? But also, what kind of people stand by and let that happen? We have had a few years of bystanders who are doing nothing, but no more. No more stealing from the poor. I want to talk about our audit and evaluation team. They're the people who figured out that the autism programs were broken in a lot of states. One state had $1 million being spent. 5 years later, $343 million. They had more autism young people than the rest of the country combined. Now, evaluation is on the tip of the spear. Our evaluation team runs something called the MFUCU program, known as the most unfortunate acronym in government. MFUCU are the Medicaid Fraud Control Units. They are 2,400 people around the country, managed by attorneys general, who are supposed to be the tip of the spear at the state level fraud, the Medicaid fraud. Some do a good job and some do not. That's why this year we have an entire new regime that we've worked out. We have an intense audit program. We renew their certification, every one of them, every year. But now the certification comes with suggestions and proposals and demands for improved behavior. And it's not just paper on a memo in an email. I'm having a face-to-face meeting with every attorney general in the United States, looking them in the eye and saying, here's what we need you to do. Here's what your numbers are. We need you to do more. We need you to do better cases. You're missing these cases. And I'm getting a gentleman's agreement from those attorneys general because they'll be held accountable for that conduct. I just want to say also evaluations and audit did some of the breakthrough work in ORR with the missing children. Again, looking for the fraudsters who came and took children from faraway lands out of facilities run by the federal government who were not the right people to take them away. How'd that happen? Who made decisions? Who looked the other way? That's the type of work we do. We have 100 data analytics people as well. We work very closely with CMS. You know, there's 6 million transactions a day come through CMS. And somebody has to write programs and look for anomalies, look for inconsistencies, and that's what they do. I don't really know how they do it, but they're very smart. They write programs to find little things like $11 million in durable medical equipment that was being billed out of a country, another country from far away on a Saturday. On a Saturday, they stopped those payments from going out the door. One last case I'll mention, just an example of the types of work we do. There's a CEO of a company called Dunn Global, sentenced to prison for orchestrating a $90 million scheme, 37 million Adderall pills. Now, those Adderall pills ended up in some of our children's college environments and elsewhere, high school. She was giving anybody who asked for them Adderall, writing prescriptions. She defrauded the insurers and was on social media promoting Adderall, prescribing to people who probably didn't even know what ADHD was. This type of case highlights the consequences of not doing fraud work. Bad drugs out on the street in the hands of people who have no business handling. As the Secretary said, every dollar we spend, waste, fraud, and abuse has a human face. Some of us have people who are receiving Medicare or Medicaid who've had trouble because of fraudsters. And this group up here says, no more. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hey, we will now start our Q&A section. We only have a few minutes for this. Sarah, go ahead.
Sarah, I'm from CNN. I wanted to ask about the prior suspensions of funds. How many of those have been resolved? Have the funds released? So we can get a sense of how long that took and how that affected patients if those were businesses.
Thanks for the question. So I'll answer the second part first, which is we haven't touched eligibility or benefits for anything. These are pauses in funds and reconciliation of funds. We're still reviewing all those quarters. We started this, I think, early February. And there's time that CMS has to respond. We send documentation requests back to the state, and it goes back and forth until we fulfill that. So that's still ongoing for those states. We hope to return funds as soon as they submit and figure out all the documentation, but those are still ongoing.
Okay, Elizabeth? Question right here in orange. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Have you been in touch with Governor Walz and Newsom before this pause? And if so, have they expressed willingness to work with you to get this funding back?
We've been working with the administrations of both those states. Minnesota's returned documents to us that, as Dan Brillman mentioned, is being evaluated very carefully. Rory over here to the left runs the FMG group, and it's his team that is working through the numbers to make sure that when there's demonstration of truth in the documents, of course, there is a deferral. The purpose is to give the money back if they can demonstrate that it's truly been well spent. We're still working through many issues with California. It's a much bigger program and lots of different kinds of issues happening in California.
Okay, great. We'll take one more right up here.
Elizabeth Schulze with ABC News. This is just for Secretary Kennedy. As you know, thousands of Americans have gotten sick from the cyclosporiasis outbreak. Would like to get your take on, does the federal government have this outbreak under control right now?
We do have the outbreak under control. We have done extensive forensics, epidemiological forensics, and we've identified the source of the outbreak. We and the companies that are involved have implemented a recall.
Any response to some of the criticism that the cuts to the federal agencies under your leadership has slowed the response to the outbreak?
Those criticisms are invalid. We've had no cuts in our surveillance program. We did cuts in the Food Net program, but they were for redundant surveillance, and all the states will tell you that. We're still doing forensics. We're still doing surveillance in all the states.
Great. Thank you, everyone. That concludes our press conference. And then everyone on stage, we're going to take a picture in front of the podium here.